here this afternoon. We're going to be considering how we can reduce the carbon footprint of arable cropping, and I've got some great collaborators here alongside me to help feed into that. But I thought to kick off I would just show you this, which somebody sent me earlier this week, which appeared in the Times newspaper, and it basically shows the temperature change which has taken place across the globe in the last 118 years, covering all the major continents. And what you can see from that, well, I could be a little bit flip here, and because, as you know, China invented global warming. So quite clearly, from about 1975 onwards, all the thermometers used to measure global temperatures have obviously been made in China. But that wouldn't be true. And I think what we see here is that there has been a change of about, on average, 1.5 degrees from ambient over that time, and that we can expect to see that going up. And so I think there really is an issue here. I'm very upbeat about this. I firmly believe that agriculture can be a massive part of the solution of helping to deal with this. But we've really got to be very smart about it. And we just started work this week on a contract with a major miller, looking at how we could reduce the carbon footprint of making a loaf of bread by 30%. And this is from throughout the whole chain. This is the farmer at the beginning, through to the transport, the miller, the baking process, and even through to the retailer. I actually think 30% is not going to be too difficult for us to actually do. It's just that we haven't focused on how we might achieve a target like that in the past. So I'm going to move my discussion on to my collaborators here next. I'm sad that... right on cue. Perfect.
Sorry, I've been in the soil pit.
Being in a soil pit is a good excuse for not being here right to start with, and I'm afraid I'm going to launch into the deep end, but you'll be just fine. Anne works for ADAS, and some years ago ADAS were commissioned to produce a report for DEFRA to inform them of the potential of UK soils to sequester carbon. Co-authors in this were the late and very great Brian Chambers, whom of course we still miss to this day, and Professor David Paulson from Rothamsted. And I think, Anne, it's very helpful if you could say a few words about that, because we need to know the scientific background and the potential for our soils to sequester carbon going forward if we to set ourselves some reasonable targets for that. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, that's what I'm on. Yeah, that's fine. So DEFRA commissioned us quite some time ago to look at various practices for sequestering carbon. The two practices that we focused on were the potential for reduced tillage and the potential of different organic materials additions to sequester carbon. As a backdrop to that, there's some key issues with regards to carbon in soils. And that is actually any practice, there's an equilibrium in a level of carbon in soil. So any practice that we adopt will, if it's a carbon improving, it will start to increase soil carbon, but that will only increase to a certain point. We can't keep on sequestering carbon in soils. It will reach an equilibrium and of inputs equaling outputs, and then it will sequester no more until you change your practice again. So, for example, in a no-till situation, you might start sequestering a bit of carbon. It will then flatten out. If you then put your plough through it, it'll start going down again. Or if you then start increasing it with organic materials, it might start going up again. But again, it will plateau. So there's a limit to how much carbon a soil can contain. But on the subject of reduced tillage and organic materials, we were looking for UK evidence of the impacts. And actually, there is limited data out there in terms of how much these practices can store carbon. And particularly for tillage practices, we were finding that actually the evidence is it's not how much carbon that is being stored, it's where the carbon is. So in actual fact, if you sample a ploughed soil, it will actually have the same organic matter content as a reduced till soil to the same depth, but it's just where that carbon is. So you tend to get a concentration of carbon in the top soil, in the top, 5 centimetres of soil, which in a ploughed situation is mixed throughout the whole lot. So we actually found, certainly for reduced, from the evidence, and I have to say it's a limited number of studies, we haven't got that many experiments in the UK, long-term experiments, because that's the other thing, to measure these changes takes a long time for a soil to increase by 1% organic matter, for example. It will take 10, 15, 20 years. So actually to reliably measure those changes is hard. So we need long-term experimentation, and we haven't really got quite that number of experiments out there to do that. So in terms of tillage, we basically say yes, it does sequester carbon, but small amounts. We came up with a figure. I quickly printed these off from old slides. This is the organic matter increase, around about 500 kilos of organic matter per hectare per year stored from a zero till situation. But the flip side of it, certainly from a carbon climate change point of view, is actually there is some evidence, certainly under UK conditions, that nitrous oxide emissions increase with no-till situations because the soil isn't quite so aerated, and nitrous and it flicks between being aerated and slightly waterlogged. And in that situation, those conditions are almost ideal for nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is more powerful than greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so actually, when you do the net greenhouse gas accounting, actually, it's not necessarily beneficial. So our message from that, certainly for reduced till, is yeah, it's great for surface organic matter content, and we should be doing it from a soil quality, soil health point of view, but not necessarily as a carbon accounting tool. And then on organic, shall I keep going? On organic material additions, we looked at, there's various long-term sites across the country looking at different organic materials being applied to soils. And yes, they will increase your organic matter level, and they will result in storing carbon. We looked and we saw that actually not all organic materials are the same. So in terms of the amount of carbon that is retained, so if you can imagine you put some carbon on and then biological processes start to decompose it, and so you do lose CO2. So again, I'm just going to refer to my crib sheet. So in terms of the best materials in terms of storing carbon were things like green compost and biosolids cake. Then cattle FYM, so if you're going down in terms of order, and then a straw. And that's really basically on how decomposed they are before you apply them to the soil. So if they haven't really gone through an animal's gut, like for example straw, or they haven't gone through the composting process, the stability of that carbon is less. So less is retained in the case of wheat straw. So is that enough?
Well, that is particularly useful when we're at an event like this, where we're often led to believe that a zero-till approach can sequester more carbon. But my perception, I share with you, which often in the past the sampling depth hasn't been adequate to take into account the more mixing that you see in the plough system, and that has distorted the results. Yeah. And I believe also that the outcome of your report from a government point of view was that they decided that they couldn't justify making a carbon sequestration payment to farmers who are adopting a modified tillage system.
That's
is
right.
that
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
So that has very important policy implications for us going forward, because at the moment we're looking to transfer what we get paid as a basic farm payment subsidy into environmental payments, and I'm very pleased that the government has included soil in its 25-year plan, although I understand what the Minister said earlier today was less encouraging about how we might benefit from any payment coming for better soil management. But it's quite clear that if we are going to pay for better soil management, it must be based on sound science. And what your science is showing us is with the nitrous oxide and the other factors that perhaps there isn't the same potential there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to introduce Richard next. Richard's been working in the organic sector, which I have some experience of, where we try to build as much biomass biologically to then release the fertility and reduce the huge carbon footprint which conventional farming has through the input of fertiliser, which accounts for about 40% of the carbon that we put into an average crop of wheat. So there is huge potential there for us to work on that. So Richard, perhaps you'd say a few words about what you're doing, and particularly the fact that you're not only a practicing farmer, but you're studying for a PhD in this area.
I'm going to stand up. Brain cells work better when they're further away from the feet, I think. So just to give you a bit of an introduction, those who don't know me. I was a conventional farmer in the 90s, took over a family farm. We were very blessed with a wonderful part of Wiltshire, but as a conventional farmer, having been an accountant and other things before that, I wanted to farm very directly, very economically, very efficiently. And I saw the quality of our soil just disappear, in fact, in front of my eyes during the 90s. And it really woke me up to what I was doing and set me on a different path. So we started organic conversion in 1998. We then started working biodynamically in the early 2000s. I saw a plough in 2003 because I didn't want to be killing the soil life that I was creating. And there were various other things, and I've got a website if you want to see all the different things that we've added to our system over the years. We try and keep things simple. We do a lot of different things. We've taken things on over the years, tried things, but in that simplicity there's a lot of diversity, and diverse layers are something that we've used since 2000 in our lay part of our phase of our rotation, and it's really important. And as part of scratching my head about what we're doing along the way, I wanted to look deeper into what we were doing, which is why I started researching for a doctorate at Reading, and it's been a fascinating process. And so we've got experiments set on around the farm looking at growing biomass in place. So it's just growing plants in place and adding them to the soil rather than taking them away. That might be crop residue, or it might be the hay or silage that you would have taken away, but we're feeding that back to the soil, and we're looking at how that impacts on the soil, how much carbon it's storing, of course. So that's been a fascinating process, and it's affected how our rotation works and the psychology behind it, if you like. I don't know how much more you want me to say. There's lots more to add, but...
well, have you got any exciting results or insights?
Okay.
Yeah, great.
So it's sort of slightly on the side of the research, but so I've been scratching my head about methane recently. Having cattle on the farm has been a guilty pleasure, if you like, for the last 6 months. And I've been thinking, do you know, there's got to be something good about this. And I'm sure the cattle farmers in this room would agree with me. Anyway, so a few weeks ago I sat down and with the help of the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit, we did a farm carbon audit. And I'll share it with you because there was an interesting outcome. 1 second, while it warms up.
I'm just going to intervene. In case anyone wants to know more about Richard's farm, he is profiled on Agricology.
Yes. So this is the simple diagram that shows the green is our carbon sequestration and the brown is what we emit. And to be honest, I was completely shocked. I was expecting it to be much more balanced. Actually, if you look at the numbers, so most of the emissions on our farm do come from the livestock, and it looks like a large number when you just look at the emissions in that way. Do I need to use the microphone? Is it all right? From the filming point of view? fine. And then I put the margins in and the hedges and the woodland, and that sort of rebalanced half of the cattle emissions. And I was thinking, oh, okay, that's pretty good. And then the more difficult bit, as you were talking about, is the soil. So then I thought, gosh, how am I going to tackle that? Well, actually, we took a lot of soil organic matter samples when we started organic conversion in the late 90s, and over the years we've added to that. So I've been looking at that and done some rough figures, so there's more detail to be had on that. But roughly we've been capturing, if you like, fixing carbon at a rate of 0.25% per annum. Now that sounds a lot compared to what Anne was saying a minute ago, but it's exciting. I mean, it's really exciting what we're doing, and there's a lot of exciting stuff going on at this show. But it's possible. You know, it makes the emissions from the cattle just so insignificant. And, you know, there's a much bigger story to be had there. The cattle form such an important part of that process of fixing carbon in the soil. And you can't do it without them. The numbers would be much lower without them. And so they add so much to the life in the soil, the turnover. One of the there's two things really which come out of my research that are really important. One is it's the turnover of carbon in the soil that's so important. It's not just fixing it and it being dead. Okay, from a farming point of view, it's the turnover, and that means the life. So that's the life, both living and dying, and you get that through tillage, and you get that through just natural living processes. And so you know, don't be too fixed on having a certain level of carbon in your soil through organic matter. When you start getting the turnover, it'll start to build up. And actually, so one of the, if I go the right way, wrong way, as Anne was saying, this graph here, which you might be able to see, I don't know, if I can make it a bit bigger, I can't, wrong place. Well, shows this sequestration process where this is a farm where it was completely arable beforehand, row cropping as they call it in the States, and then they put it into pasture, and they found that actually over a 6-year period you get an accumulation of carbon, but it doesn't start until the 2nd year, and then it's quite a steep curve, this part of the graph here, and then it plateaus, as Anne was saying. So what we've done is made our lay phase longer, so we're moving further up this curve. But actually we were doing all that fixing that I talked about only with a two-year lay. But I think the lay is really important. You know, having legumes and grasses as a mixture. We have a very diverse group of species, 23 species, 33 varieties in our diverse lay mixture. And that variety is really important. So diversity for adversity.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And I think that there's a really, really important point there, and that is about this turnover of organic matter, because we know that is the food source in the soil for all the microorganisms, and the more you're turning over, the more of those you're going to have there. So that's actually a sign of great health. Now I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who has got some experience in trying to retain nitrogen in the system, and we heard about how that's a big carbon footprint in growing the crop, so trying to stop that leaking out through the soil is really important. But also he's worked very much on a farming systems approach, and I think increasingly that is showing that longer sequences of better thought out combinations of cropping, which are not just looking at maximum output in terms of tonnage or profitability, but actually looking at the health of the soil as an output, is also particularly valued. So Nathan, please.
Hey, good afternoon everybody. So I'm Nathan Morris, I work at NIAB, and I'm looking at some of the farming systems projects, so mainly around building soil fertility into an arable, conventional arable rotation, but also looking at cultivations, integrating cultivations and cover crops, again to look at how we can reduce that overall energy, if you like, the carbon use either from tillage or from crops and inputs as well. So the focus I'll do today is mainly around looking at the either cover crops or the intercropping with clover, which was quite a novel technique, and it probably still is slightly outside the realms of conventional arable farming at the moment. But it's certainly interesting to look at how we've basically, for the clover bicrop, we use a small-leaved white clover. We sow that in the beginning of the rotation, and it grows as an understory in a standard arable rotation for cropping. So we typically are winter cereal based, so either wheat or barley with spring breaks. The idea is to retain that clover in the bottom canopy, and so we don't plough, but we use most typical herbicides as you'd expect for those crops, and that actually works quite well because it actually knocks the clover back, and as we've probably heard today or yesterday, actually that interaction of using either grazing or mowing or using chemicals to knock the clover back releases the nitrogen, hopefully at the right time when you can actually get the crop to pick it up. And we've seen quite interesting responses. Certainly at the lower end doses, we've seen favourable responses from that clover fixing nitrogen and feeding that back into the system, particularly in the cereal crops. We see some quite positive 0.3, 0.4 tonne responses in yield. But obviously there is a strong interaction with the conventional nitrogen fertiliser that you typically apply. So at the full end rate, because of that interaction, we actually don't really retain the clover as we would perhaps like. So the system is very much in development, but it's certainly something where I think if we are looking at our carbon footprint and obviously the chances with ammonium nitrate, the very high energy and carbon costs associated with that, if we are moving away perhaps from where we are at the moment in terms of nitrogen inputs on crops, that sort of system might become more profitable. The only thing I'd also add is there's obviously lots of practicalities along that road, that journey that we've had. We had most recent, because of that interaction with the high nitrogen rates, the clover has actually basically died out from that competition with a strong crop and the added fertiliser. So we've been looking to reseed it, and we've had a few, no one really quite knew whether it was best to basically just broadcast them in as a low cost option, or whether to spend a lot of money, drill it, or even go one step further than that and actually spend the money to drill it and then actually leave it without a crop for a year. So there's quite a big income loss associated with that, but to really allow that clover to establish. So we thought, well, okay, we'll start from the beginning and we'll do it the cheapest and hopefully the easiest way. Of course that didn't work, so unfortunately, very disappointed. So over the time we've actually found that yes, you do actually need to obviously establish it, and really we took a year out to really get the clover re-established. And then we went in with oilseed rape this year, which I was quite excited with, until unfortunately the oilseed rape didn't grow where we'd grown the clover. It grew everywhere else in the rotation, but where we had the clover, and I suspect because of the actual sward and the mat of roots we'd created, which again I'll go into a bit of detail on the soil property side, but on the crop side and trying to get a small seeded crop established into that mat, it was probably not so good.
I want to bring Ian in at this point, if I may, because one thing you flagged up here is that your clovers died, and quite obviously when we're designing these mixes within rotations that are going to take up free nitrate and fix nitrate for us and help to keep that carbon footprint down, we're going to have to design mixes that are going to be able to do that. So Ian, you've spent a lot of time doing this in your company and very effectively. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Gould from Oakbank. We've actually done exactly the type of work you're talking about with the same kind of small leaf white clover. And our solution to getting rape established is to plant the clover with the rape. That has a number of benefits. One is they're the same size seed, so you can mix them together very happily. And these physical, practical application problems are one of the main drivers that people don't have a go. So a simple system like mixing the same seed in the same place with a cash crop, the crucial part of that is that you get the cash crop established properly, because the cash crop brings in the cash, and the other bits are very nice to have, and when we can work with them and they bring these benefits like reducing carbon or producing carbon and reducing nitrogen applications, they're great. But if your cash crop fails as a result, no one's going to do this for very long. the technology now in drills, and anyone who walks up the hill with the number of different hoppers and application methods and inter-row planting and mixing this different size seeds, planting at different rates, different depths all at the same time in one go, are absolutely remarkable. And it just shows the ingenuity of our industry that we can deal with these technical challenges very, very well. What we try and do is we don't have a standard range of mixes. Our first question is always, what's your problem? What are you trying to deal with? And particularly, I'm based in Cambridgeshire, and in some years you don't know whether a wheat crop is a hay crop because of the amount of blackgrass in it when you drive past this time of year. So blackgrass is one thing that's very, very prevalent and top of people's minds. And some of the wording that we talk about in some of these small seeds and intercrops and so on, we need to be very careful, because I don't believe cover crops kill blackgrass, for example, but they can be used as part of the tools in the armoury to do this, and they can certainly be helped to improve the soil circumstances for the cash crop to become established into and make it a better environment. So we can use plants to take jobs out, then that's bound to improve our carbon footprint, because we're not using equipment, we're not using chemical sprays, we're not using chemical fertilisers as much. But this has to be set in the context that the business has to be profitable as well. And it is a difficult balance, and sometimes people assess success and failure without maybe considering all of the factors that took that into account. So, for example, I think last year a lot of people talked about oilseed rape failing because of flea beetle. Personally, I think the main reason it failed was because of the drought, which then allowed the flea beetle much longer to kill the crop. And people have decided they're not going to grow rape because they can't deal with the flea beetle. But my suggestion to them is that if you get to oilseed rape planting time and conditions are favourable, then have a go. If you get to that time and it's horribly dry and the forecast is no rain for 3 or 4 weeks, then it's probably not a good choice. And that's the same for all these other crops as well, is you need to think about on a field by field basis. Give you a good example with the clover. If you were planting rape into a field that grew rape really well, but you knew that it suffered from cranesbill and thistles, which are very, very easily dealt with AstroCurb, but AstroCurb deals with clover really well as well. So if you know you've got that problem, you have to be honest with yourself that this isn't a good decision, because you end up actually spending more carbon remediating a problem that you could have avoided in the first place. Yeah. So there's an awful lot to learn. My biggest learning point at the moment is going to be the effect of herbicides that were applied to the crop before the cover crop we're putting in, to see how they affect us going forward. And things like legumes are very susceptible to products like clopyralid, which is commonly known as Dow Shield. And if we have a year like 2017, which was a very wet winter, is the effect going to be very different to a 2018 when we've had a very dry winter and then a very wet summer? And all of those problems are challenges to people like myself, because people want solutions in a bag.
Right, great. Well, thank you very much for that. Some really valuable points made there, and I have to say 1 or 2 of the scenarios that you outlined there I've experienced, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Now, I do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions of our speakers, so please indicate if you'd like to, and somebody will bring you a microphone and fire away.
Thank you very much to all the speakers, really fascinating. There's a question I wanted to ask Anne. You made that really interesting point at the beginning about potential for increased nitrous oxide emission if you are not ploughing. Would the impact of running livestock over a soil, the trampling effect, if you graze stubbles and that sort of thing, would that alleviate that problem?
The issue probably not. The issue is about nitrous oxide comes off the soil when it goes from periods of aeration to being anaerobic. So a compacted soil that's not regularly aerated is more vulnerable to nitrous oxide emissions than an uncompacted soil. So if you've got trampling cows, for example, you've got the liability to, it depends on your soil type, on a clay soil, for example, then then there could be the potential for increasing your nitrous oxide emissions, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I saw some more hands up. You on shy?
Let's make a point about.
Yeah, absolutely. Ian?
I'd actually like to ask Anne, I think I can change the porosity and the aerobic capacity of the soil using plants regardless of the tillage system, and certainly in a no-till system I'd like to think I could use roots to stop it becoming waterlogged or anaerobic. So then we've got the benefits of the no-till system without the downsides. Do you think that would make a big difference?
I totally agree. You've got both a double whammy. Cover cropping in a no-till situation is really good for the soil. Do you want to say something, Nathan?
Just to add to that, that's absolutely, from our work with the white clover, that's one of the real benefits we've seen is with that root structure it has. It's really opened up the soil, so in terms of bulk density, in terms of water infiltration, we've seen a huge improvement in that soil structure, and that's exactly what we're saying. In that surface layer where we're cultivating, trying to get the crops established, if we've got those better soil conditions that potentially negate some of the nitrous oxide risks, then that's got to be a good thing.
Excellent, thank you. Right, any more? Yes, George.
Question for Richard. You said you'd sold your plough in 2003, is that right? How are you establishing your crops and controlling weeds in an organic situation?
So we use a cultivator. After pasture, we'll use 2.5-inch tine, travelling it in one direction, gaps between, and then travel at 90 degrees, and then we'll use a duck foot afterwards. Don't try and do it with a duck foot straight away, because you just create lots of turf and then you end up pushing it around all summer. So it's about creating small pieces of soil which then can die off as you move them. So we normally cultivate 3 times before we sow, and that's much less fuel and time than ploughing. It's much kinder on the soil. And then we do a similar process after cereals as well. So cereal followed by another cereal.
I'm looking at Tim. What do we like for time, Tim?
You guys could get home.
Yeah, nobody following us though, is there?
No one's following.
No, that's fine. Can we get a microphone to the gentleman there at the back there? Please, thank you.
I'm just going to ask again, Anne, if I may, about the no-till and nitrous oxide. It seems a surprising finding, and I wonder, I think you mentioned that there wasn't that much evidence in the UK.
Well,
so I wonder if, I wonder if you think you're absolutely certain and confident in that, or if that's data that might change as no-till used more widely.
It's totally, there is limited data on it. It's obviously quite an expensive process, measuring and that kind of thing. And it's not, I'm not saying carte blanche that actually no-till is shocking for nitrous. No way. It's totally dependent on the circumstances of your soil type. But there has been evidence that nitrous oxide emissions, it's all to do with the level of aeration and compaction within your soil. If your soil goes anaerobic, periodically between anaerobic, aerobic, that is sort of almost ideal, so conditions. But if you can improve that, if you can improve your soil structure is key. So if you can got a good soil structure, then there shouldn't be an issue.
Might one of the issues, Anne, here be that sometimes zero tillers are very single-minded in their cultivation approaches, and that sometimes they have some compaction in their own heads, which we can't get a low disturbance subsoiler through. That would really help.
Would help, yes, yeah. Actually, sometimes the lowest disturbance subsoil is what is needed.
Okay, thank you. Yep. Any more? I see one here. Henry. Yes, very good. Thank you.
I have yet another question for Anne, if I may. Looking at the soil organic matter building up and plateauing under various interventions, that's showing the concentration of organic matter in your sample. Do you think there's scope for increasing the depth of the topsoil, taking carbon matter deeper in the soil?
That has been one of the. Well, if you look at, there's various reports out that say these are all the different carbon improving practices, and one of the suggestions is to try and get carbon deep down in the soil, whether that's by encouraging earthworms to take it down, whether that's through deep rooting species, that kind of thing, which in my book, is totally feasible, but the scientific evidence to back that up isn't there. And actually, the issue is quantifying. At the end of the day, it's quantifying what changes in organic matter, organic carbon, which are quite small, against a huge backdrop of organic matter in the soil. And we know that changes over time. So in your situation, 5-10 years, you might be able to measure differences. But we haven't got necessarily the analytical power to do it, soil variability, that kind of thing. But yes, that is definitely one way of trying to do it, get carbon deeper.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. I'm going to wrap things up there by, first of all, thank you to the audience for coming and for asking your questions. For our panel here, who've given us some really diverse answers into an area of the problem. And thank you very much, of course, to our hosts for the talk this afternoon, indeed over the last 2 days, the great Agricology Project.